Hello, my name is Frank Gaffney. I'm delighted to be the host of this edition of The Big Picture, and we're going to be continuing a conversation we began with David Maxwell, a distinguished U.S. military officer turned senior fellow in a very prestigious think tank here in Washington, D.C., the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We're asking about the threat that we are facing, the military order of battle, and the doctrine and the intentions of the North Korean regime, all of which should make this very much a front burner issue for those of us who are concerned about security more generally in North Asia, but specifically that affecting our allies and friends in South Korea, our forces that are there to defend them, and our other allies in the region, notably Japan and Taiwan and the like. We're talking with David now about a problem that has arguably considerably compounded some of the dangers, and that is the determination of the South Korean government under Moon Jae-in and some of its admirers in the United States to press forward with some kind of peace declaration or perhaps agreement or even treaty to formally end a war that arguably hasn't really ended at all. David Maxwell, thank you again for joining us for this conversation and for helping us understand that against the backdrop of some of the most ominous military capabilities on the planet today, namely those of North Korea, right in the area just north of the demilitarized zone, we may actually see conditions created, for the best of intentions, of course, that make that peril even greater for the South Koreans than it is at the moment. Talk a little bit about that.
Very true. And first, let me just put one thing in perspective and how important the Korean Peninsula is to the United States.
Yes, please talk
first, of course, we don't want to see war on the peninsula. But it is in the U.S. interest to prevent war, to deter war. We don't want to see conflict. We do want peace. I mean, I think every American and every Korean wants peace.
Right.
But North Korea remains a threat.
Americans lost their lives on that peninsula,
right,
as you know so well, trying to protect it.
But what happens on the Korean Peninsula is not going to be confined to the Korean Peninsula. Mm-hmm. It will have global effects. Right. Now, let's just look at the region right now. So you have South Korea as the 10th largest economy in the world, and its economy is important to the global economy. You have the second and third largest economies, China and Japan. They will be affected by whatever happens. You have two nuclear powers, China and Russia, that border on the rogue state that possesses nuclear weapons, North Korea. So you have really a tinderbox. And so if there is conflict or other contingencies such as regime collapse, instability inside North Korea, all of that is going to affect supply chain. It's going to affect refugees. It's going to affect security in the region. It will have global effects. Mm-hmm. And so from an American perspective, it is in our interest to do what we can to deter war. And ultimately, we want to see unification. But we want to see unification that is based on a secure, stable, non-nuclear peninsula that is unified under a constitutional form of government, liberal democracy, free market economy, rule of law, not rule by law, and human rights for all in North Korea. And that would look like a United Republic of Korea, mm-hmm. Which would be the acronym UROK, mm-hmm. pronounced UROK. Mm-hmm. And so we want to see a United Republic of Korea as the only way out of this mm-hmm. problem, the only way to end the nuclear threat, and the only way to stop the human rights abuses in the North is unification under a United Republic of Korea. So that's the perspective that we must look at what is happening now on the peninsula.
Can you get there from here if what you start with as a engine for bringing it about is some kind of, as I say, peace declaration or agreement or treaty that doesn't require any of those sorts of changes to take place north of the DMZ, making it possible for there to be reunification on such terms?
Let me be blunt about my South Korean allies, and the Korean people who I love very much. But the Moon Jae-in administration is really basing its strategy on appeasement. It is an appeasement strategy.
I'm afraid you're right.
And it is the idea that a declaration of the end of the war on the Korean Peninsula will entice Kim Jong Un to negotiate as a responsible member of the international community is delusional. And so, if that does happen, if there's a unilateral declaration, assuming the United States government and South Korea agreed to that, which I frankly don't believe the United States government will ever agree to any unilateral declaration.
From your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, but if they did that, it will put into a play that will be very dangerous to us. And what that will do, it plays right into North Korean hands and objectives, and two, the political factions in South Korea and in the United States who blame the United States for the division, who blame the United States for preventing unification, preventing peace, they will want to say, now that the war has ended, it is time to remove U.S. troops and end the alliance and end extended deterrence. And because what Kim Jong Un wants, and Kim Jong Un says, and Kim Yo Jong, his evil sister, will say that they want an end of the U.S. hostile policy. Moon Jae-in believes that a way to demonstrate the end of the hostile policy of the alliance is to declare an end to the war. Right. But what Kim Jong Un wants, he doesn't want a declaration of the end of the war. He wants an end of the alliance. He wants concrete steps that will demonstrate to him that we no longer have hostile intent towards the North. And that means removing troops. That means extended deterrence and the nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan ended. Yeah. And there are factions within the United States and in South Korea who will push for that. And
let me come back to that. I just want to round this out. You're saying that he has these concerns about, the United States continuing hostility, and he needs to be satisfied that that's been allayed by removing U.S. forces. In point of fact, isn't it the case that he wants those forces out so that he can revert to the physical conquest that was denied his grandfather 5 to 6 decades ago?
That is exactly the strategy. Right. And, the question I always ask, have we seen any evidence that he has given up that objective? And there's no evidence of that. If you listen to their rhetoric, if you read their constitution, they have to complete the revolution and rid the peninsula of foreign influence. If you read their party documents, there is no indication that they have given up that objective.
Yeah.
Now,
and not least, you look at the actual facts on the ground, going back to what we've been talking about in terms of the order of battle right across the DMZ.
Exactly. And you look at their actions for the last 70 years. Yeah. It is subversion, and it is preparation to use force if the conditions are right. And those conditions, they have to achieve the right conditions, and that is splitting the ROC-U.S. alliance and getting U.S. forces off the peninsula. Right. We know from Hwang Jung-yap, the highest-ranking defector, in 1997 when he left because he believed that Kim Jong-il was going to start a war. And he came to the South, and after being debriefed, our first questions to him is, North Korea has spent all these resources on developing the fourth largest army in the world. Why haven't you resumed hostilities to achieve your objective? And he looked at us like we were unicorns. And he said, we know that we cannot win a war against South Korea with U.S. support. And as long as there are U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea cannot win a war. He also said that they know that if they attack, that the U.S. will use nuclear weapons against North Korea. And that really indicates two things. Our declaratory policy works, but it's also illustrative of why North Korea has been pursuing nuclear weapons since the 1950s. The 1950s. I mean, they sent 250 scientists to Moscow to get PhDs in technical engineering disciplines. They got their first experimental nuclear reactor in 1962. They have been pursuing nuclear weapons since the 1950s.
To say nothing of, as you said earlier, their relationship with A.Q. Khan, which I think was just nukes are us marketplace.
So there is no evidence that they have given up their objective to dominate the Korean Peninsula. Right. And we must keep that in mind as we move forward with these kind of proposals, which, again, I have said and I will say that they are frankly delusional. They will not achieve the objectives that some desire.
Yeah. Subversive is another word for it. And the question that I have for you is, clearly part of the North Korean doctrine is subverting South Korea as another means to the end of overtaking it and bringing it under their heel. Is subversion inside the United States something that is also being practiced? Are there, I mean, it's hard to believe there are people who are actually advocating on behalf of the North Korean government, given how horrific it is in every respect. But are there, in fact, influence operators working for the United Front Department of North Korea in the United States? And do you think that probably has something to do with these proposals now being brought up in Congress?
Well, I think
at least introduced into Congress.
You know, you mentioned the United Front Department. They also have the 225th Bureau, which is their covert action arm to establish opposition political parties and really to conduct political influence operations.
Talk about the United Front as well.
The United Front, they are charged with North-South relations, and they are really the overt arm, but that is really charged with subversion. And then they have the Reconnaissance General Bureau, which is kind of like a combination CIA Special Forces, where they infiltrate, conduct different kinds of operations. But influence operations is really what it's all about. Now, I have no evidence that there are active agents, that are running operations in the United States. However, I have no evidence that there's not.
Right.
And, we have in New York, there is the North Korean delegation. We call that the New York Channel, which is very useful for diplomacy. But there are Americans that have contact with these North Koreans. Now, I believe that at the best case, we have Americans who are of that famous term, useful idiots.
Right.
And I believe that they believe that they are acting in good faith and good conscience. I also believe that they are very likely manipulated by people smarter than them, and they come from North Korea. And they may not even present themselves as from North Korea. They may present themselves in many different ways. The North Koreans, we think of this backward country, they're very sophisticated.
Right. It helps, though, I think, too, to going back to what we talked about earlier, the Chinese relationship. They're all about United Front and
every communist
influence
country.
operations.
I mean,
all of them. That's right. It's part of the playbook.
It is.
But here's the question, and you may or may not interpret this as evidence of influence operations. I frankly do. We have a piece of legislation, H.R. 3446, the so-called Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, that would put the United States in precisely the position you just described, which is on the defensive, seemingly opposed to peace on the peninsula, enabling the North Koreans to further subvert in the South and get the Moon government further embroiled in, some sort of post-unification enterprise. All the while, as you know better than just about anybody, by virtue of your own hard service in that country and your eyes on, literally, the nature of the enemy we're confronting across that demilitarized zone, that they are ready to go to war again at a moment's notice. And arguably it would be infinitely worse than the first time around because of all the weapons of mass destruction and the like that they now have in their kit. So what are we to make of the fact that you have, in some cases, some respected members of the United States House of Representatives who are sponsoring this H.R. 3446, seemingly oblivious to what you've just said?
Well, I think, North Korea is the hardest target. It is hardest to understand, and as you've mentioned here many times, we don't study it, we don't understand it, and I believe that there are people, I think congressmen, they have a peace agenda, they believe in peace, and unfortunately, what they are really striving for is peace at any cost. And that is a dangerous way to look at things, because peace at any cost, that cost is going to come in blood and treasure.
No question.
And that's what we need to really understand. As I said, we all support peace. I think every military person on the Korean Peninsula and in uniform in the United States wants peace. I think all of our political leadership want peace. But it cannot be at the expense of the security of South Korea or a major conflict in the peninsula. And that is why it is absolutely necessary that we must understand the nature of the Kim family regime, the evil Kim family regime, what its objectives are to dominate the Korean peninsula, and its strategy to use subversion and force to unify the peninsula under the guerrilla dynasty and Gulag state and enslave 48 million Koreans in the South.
Exactly. Whether they want to be enslaved or not, needless to say. I'm reminded at this particular moment, in the aftermath of this ignominious defeat of the United States, despite the extraordinary combat arms that people like you wielded in defense of Afghanistan, that we could possibly even be indulging in a conversation about, let alone thinking that there was some utility to ending an endless war, a war that's gone on arguably for 70 years now, by simply declaring it over, which is exactly, of course, what the Biden administration did in Afghanistan, to the most unhappy of results. Is there a complete, I mean, even people who profess to want peace and are willing to pursue it willy-nilly, even they must, in the aftermath of this debacle, be mindful that you don't want to do this again with the stakes even higher in the Korean Peninsula for all the reasons you've mentioned.
Well, I think, sadly to say, I think one of America's strategic weaknesses, despite being a global power, we are very good at compartmentalizing. And I think that there are some people who say Afghanistan's Afghanistan, Korea is Korea, and they are not the same, which is true to a great extent. What is a problem, though, is that we think we can conduct activities, whether diplomatic or military, in one part of the world, and to not understand that the rest of the world is paying attention. You know, I believe that Kim Jong Un has looked at what's happened in Afghanistan, and one of the things that he's taken away is the evacuation of Americans in harm's way. Well, we have hundreds of thousands of Americans in South Korea, you know, and they will have to be evacuated.
To say nothing of allies that we would feel constrained to try to help.
And paradoxically, 1 million Chinese citizens in South Korea.
Is that right?
Yes.
Oh my God.
So think about that. And he could create havoc as part of his subversion. You know, if he raises tension and a decision to withdraw, because the decision to withdraw in Afghanistan was made too late. And so now he might believe that we will make an early decision. Well, if we make an early decision to withdraw U.S. forces, we will break the South Korean economy. Yeah. It will collapse.
Really?
And, well, certainly, because confidence in security will end because we are sending the signal that we are preparing for war by evacuating our citizens. And, I mean, it will be a run on the banks, you know, and so their economy will fold. What an act of subversion that is.
No kidding.
And so North Korea studies everything we do around the world, as the Chinese do and the Russians do. But North Korea pays attention, and they look for ways to take advantage. And we, to our great discredit, we don't often pay attention to how our actions influence those of others and how those others might use what we've done against us.
Yes.
And we need to be well aware of that. But again, it comes back to understanding what North Korea's strategy and objectives are.
And again, I'm inclined to say the help that they get from the Chinese, obviously, but also arguably from the Russians and the Iranians. I mean, these are all birds of a feather, at least in the sense that they're deeply hostile to us in the West. And to the extent that they are mutually advancing a common agenda to try to undermine our civilization, our world, our power, you're absolutely right, David Maxwell. We cannot afford to ignore it.
I'm glad you mentioned Iran, because when you really look at it, we define our threats as 5. The 2 revisionist powers, China and Russia, the 2 rogue powers, North Korea and Iran, and violent extremist organizations. 4 of those major threats, the nexus is in North Korea. We didn't talk about the relationship between North Korea and Iran.
Say a word about it. We're almost out of time.
Where do you think Iran gets its missile capabilities?
Right.
And I believe that there is likely collaboration. I mean, we're thankful to the Israelis for destroying Iraq's nuclear reactor in 1981, Syria's nuclear development in 2007, and what of potential cooperation between North Korea and Iran on nuclear development? I think we have to ask that question. And so this is why the Korean Peninsula is so important. It is the nexus of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And it is a strategic problem that has vexed the United States and will continue to do so as long as the Kim family regime remains in power.
You've done a marvelous job of analyzing the history here and our present state of affairs. Let me ask you to get into the crystal ball gazing business. There's a lot of talk at the moment, as you know. We touched on it a moment ago by at least in passing mention. that China is preparing to go to war against Taiwan and perhaps against its friends, including the United States. There's also talk that they may be preparing to go to war against India as well. What are the chances, if they were going to go for it, especially a two-front war, no less, against the United States, among other comers, that they would signal to the North Koreans it's time to go ugly and create a distraction, or worse, perhaps even a fresh onslaught against the South, as a means of tying up forces, as a means of keeping our head focused elsewhere, our resources not least. As you know, they're finite, especially in the far Western Pacific. Is this the kind of scenario that we should be thinking about against the backdrop of what you just said?
This is a huge strategic problem that we have tried to deal with since the end of the Cold War. We've looked at two theater wars, two major wars. We've looked at win, hold, win a war in one while holding another and then winning. But the proximity of North Korea and Taiwan is such that if there's conflict in one, there's likely to be conflict in others. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also interesting to look at history. Mm-hmm. When the Korean War started, the first thing we did, the first military action we took, was not sending MacArthur to Korea, was sending the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Straits, because China was preparing to unify in 1950. Right. That was their desire. And it was Kim Il-sung's, manipulation of both Mao and Stalin that prevented Mao from unifying China. And so, when you look at the arc of history, it is North Korea that prevented Chinese unification. So if China has designs to start a war, I would imagine that they would want North Korea to contribute in any way possible. They also might not need to direct North Korea. I think North Korea, we have to consider them a spoiler in what we are calling great power competition, or now strategic competition. North Korea is going to be a spoiler. And if there's conflict, yes, I think we are going to face a very complex situation, which is why it is necessary that we rebuild and strengthen our alliances. AUKUS, Australia, the UK, the United States, we're seeing European powers, France, Germany, the UK, deploying naval forces to the Pacific. We really need the Quad, and all of these, and of course our bilateral alliances: South Korea, U.S., Japan, U.S., Australia, even Philippines and Thailand. All of our alliances are critical to national security of the United States and the national security of each of our alliance partners, and that is how we both deter war with China and North Korea, and it is how, if we have to fight, it is how we fight and win.
Yeah. You've hit so many key points in that summary message, and I thank you for it. One in particular that resonates with me is something you actually said a moment ago, which is everybody's watching. And it's not just our enemies, it's our allies too. And the importance of those alliance relationships, strained in some cases, as I believe the one in particular with the Moon government has become, not because we want it to be, but because the Moon political team, I think, is very much set on that idea, distance themselves and if possible get us out of there. But we're at a point now where everybody, post-Afghanistan in particular, I think, is wondering, can they have confidence in us? Will we be the faithful ally to them? Not just is it worth it to risk what might be involved in being a faithful ally to us. That's getting sportier and sportier, obviously, in the face of, notably, but not exclusively, the threat from the Chinese Communist Party, a multifaceted threat, military among many others, but also from the North Koreans, their proxies on the Korean Peninsula. David Maxwell, I want to thank you again for your extraordinary service to our country in the uniform of the United States Army, for the work that you're doing these days at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies to bring the kinds of insights that your experience in service to our country have given you and that we desperately need to be paying attention to. As you've said, it's time we get about that. I'm delighted to have had a chance to visit with David, but also with you. I hope you will be back for more of the big picture in the near future. Till then, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks so much for being with us.